Most people think believing in yourself means confidence, standing taller, speaking louder, looking fearless in front of other people. But that is not belief. That is performance. Real self-belief is much darker than people imagine, because the moment you truly begin trusting yourself, you stop needing permission from the world. And that quietly threatens everyone whose identity depends on your obedience. Carl Jung once wrote that the privilege of a lifetime is becoming who you truly are. But what he didn't say directly is that this transformation almost always begins with isolation. At first, nothing dramatic happens. You simply start noticing things. The way certain people only like you when you are uncertain. The way your humor becomes arrogance the moment you stop self-deprecating. The way some friendships feel uncomfortable when you stop shrinking yourself to protect their ego. And slowly a disturbing realization begins to form. Many people never loved the real you. They just loved the version of you that doubted itself. Because self-doubt makes people predictable, controllable, safe. A person who truly believes in themselves becomes difficult to manipulate. That is why so many individuals unconsciously destroy their own confidence before the world even has the chance to attack it. They learn early that visibility creates danger. So they become smaller, quieter, easier to digest. The tragedy is that after years of doing this, they no longer recognize the performance. They call it humility, but deep down something feels wrong. Carl Jung believed the human mind contains a shadow, the rejected parts of ourselves buried beneath social conditioning. Most people imagine the shadow as anger, jealousy, or violence. But sometimes the shadow is your ambition, your intelligence, your intensity, your potential. The parts of you that other people subtly taught you to suppress. And the terrifying part is that the longer you betray yourself, the more resentment begins leaking into your personality in invisible ways. You become exhausted around successful people, defensive around confident people, suspicious of anyone who lives freely. Not because you hate them, because they remind you of the version of yourself you abandoned long ago. People don't resent your weakness. They resent the possibility that you might outgrow them. And somewhere in the silence of your life, you already know exactly who becomes uncomfortable when you start changing. That awareness is where the real transformation begins. Not with motivation, with recognition. There is a moment that happens quietly inside certain people. No applause, no visible breakthrough, no dramatic cinematic transformation, just a strange shift in perception. They begin realizing how much of their personality was constructed for survival. The agreeable tone, the constant explaining, the nervous laughter, the habit of apologizing before speaking. None of it was accidental, it was adaptation. Because somewhere in childhood, adolescence, or humiliation, they learned a dangerous psychological rule. Being fully yourself can cost you love. So, the mind develops masks. Jung called this the persona. The social self designed to function in society. And the persona is useful until you forget it is a mask. That is when the performance consumes the identity. You start monitoring every word before saying it. You analyze facial expressions like hidden threats. You become addicted to being understood, while secretly hiding everything real about yourself. And eventually something fractures internally. Because the human mind can survive pain far longer than it can survive self-betrayal. This is why some people feel strangely empty even when life appears stable. The problem is not failure. The problem is disconnection. A person can survive rejection, but surviving years without authenticity slowly creates psychological numbness. And numb people become dangerous in subtle ways, not violent, just hollow. They stop pursuing what they actually want. They settle into routines that drain them. They remain in relationships where their spirit quietly dies in exchange for emotional safety. Then one day they wake up with a terrifying realization. They became someone they would never admire. Kindness without boundaries quietly teaches people how to use you. Most individuals discover this too late. At first, people praise your patience, your understanding nature, your willingness to tolerate disrespect peacefully. But underneath social politeness, human beings instinctively test limits. Not consciously, not maliciously, just naturally. And when you constantly sacrifice your own needs to maintain harmony, people slowly stop seeing you as a person with boundaries. They begin seeing you as emotional infrastructure. Something reliable, something endlessly available, something that exists for their comfort. The disturbing truth is that excessive self-sacrifice rarely creates respect. It creates unconscious entitlement. This is why people are often shocked when the quiet person finally changes. The accommodating friend becomes distant. The patient partner becomes cold. The people pleaser suddenly disappears without explanation. But the transformation did not happen overnight. It was years of silent resentment reaching critical mass. Because deep down, every human being wants to feel real. And eventually the soul begins punishing every version of you that was built only to survive other people. That punishment appears as anxiety, exhaustion, overthinking, and depression, without visible cause. The mind is complicated. But sometimes suffering is simply the psychological cost of abandoning yourself for too long. The frightening part is this: most people never reconnect with who they actually are. They die as their persona. The strange thing about believing in yourself is that it rarely feels empowering in the beginning. It feels lonely, because once you stop needing constant validation, entire social dynamics begin shifting around you. Conversations feel different. Friendships reveal hidden conditions. People who once seemed supportive suddenly become distant the moment you stop asking for approval. At first, this can be confusing. Then you begin noticing a pattern. Some people only feel comfortable around versions of you that remain uncertain. The insecure version, the dependent version, the version that constantly seeks reassurance before making decisions. But confidence changes the balance of power inside relationships. And power, even emotional power, makes people uncomfortable. Most relationships don't end when respect disappears. They end when awareness appears. That awareness is painful because it forces you to see something most people spend their lives avoiding. Human connection is often more conditional than it appears. People say they want honesty, but what they usually want is emotional predictability. They want the version of you they learned how to control. The moment you begin trusting your own instincts, the invisible contracts start breaking. You stop over-explaining yourself. You stop defending every decision. You stop begging people to understand your intentions. And strangely, this silence irritates people more than arguments ever did, because self-belief creates emotional independence. And emotionally independent people are difficult to manipulate through guilt, shame, or fear of rejection. This is why Jung believed individuation, becoming your true self, is one of the most painful psychological processes a person can experience. You are not just discovering yourself. You are grieving every false identity that once kept you socially accepted. The obedient child, the endlessly agreeable friend, the version of yourself designed to avoid conflict at all costs. Each identity protected you once, but eventually protection becomes imprisonment. There comes a point where remaining small hurts more than being judged. And that is usually the exact moment a person begins changing for real. Not externally, internally. The shift becomes visible in tiny behaviors. They stop chasing people who pull away. They stop panicking when misunderstood. They stop interpreting rejection as proof of worthlessness. Instead, they begin observing human behavior with disturbing clarity. They notice how often people project their insecurities onto others, how frequently criticism is disguised envy, how many social rules exist only to keep individuals psychologically obedient. People who betray themselves long enough eventually forget what genuine desire even feels like. That is the true danger. Not failure, not rejection, amnesia of the self. And once this realization enters your mind, you cannot fully return to ignorance. You begin seeing masks everywhere. At work, inside friendships, inside families, even inside yourself, especially inside yourself. Because the hardest illusion to destroy is the one you created to survive. Most people spend their entire lives trying to avoid discomfort. But Jung understood something darker. The parts of your personality that contain the most power are often hidden beneath the emotions you avoid the most. Fear, anger, loneliness, shame. Not because these emotions are noble, but because they reveal where your false self begins to crack. A person who never questions themselves remains psychologically asleep. They follow inherited beliefs, inherited fears, inherited limitations, and eventually they confuse familiarity with truth. That is why genuine self-belief feels unsettling. It forces confrontation with parts of yourself you spent years suppressing. Not all weakness is weakness. Sometimes weakness is exhausted strength that was never allowed to express itself. Think about how many people secretly live divided lives. Externally calm, internally furious, externally social, internally disconnected, externally confident, internally terrified that nobody would stay if the mask disappeared. The human mind becomes incredibly skilled at fragmentation, and over time, the performance becomes automatic. You smile while feeling empty. You say, "I'm fine," without hearing yourself anymore. You continue routines that slowly destroy your spirit because uncertainty feels more frightening than misery. Then one day something small happens. A betrayal, a humiliation, a period of isolation, a moment where nobody comes to save you. And strangely, that becomes the beginning. Because pain has a brutal way of exposing illusions. Suddenly you see who disappears when you stop being useful, who only contacts you when they need emotional comfort, who becomes uncomfortable when you start valuing yourself more highly. And once seen, these patterns become impossible to unsee. People are often loyal to the role you play in their life, not the reality of who you are. That realization changes a person permanently, not into someone cruel, into someone observant, someone slower to trust empty words, someone less hypnotized by appearances, someone who understands that human beings rarely reveal themselves directly. They reveal themselves through patterns, repeated disrespect, subtle envy disguised as jokes, support that quietly disappears once you begin succeeding. The frightening thing is that many people already sense these dynamics intuitively. They just suppress the awareness because accepting it would require changing their entire life, and change threatens identity. Even painful identities become addictive when they are familiar enough. That is why people remain in toxic friendships for years, why they tolerate emotional manipulation, why they continuously betray their instincts to preserve social belonging. Because isolation terrifies the human nervous system. But there is another kind of terror people rarely discuss. The terror of realizing you abandoned yourself just to avoid being abandoned by others. That realization arrives silently, usually late at night, usually during moments of stillness, usually when distractions stop working. And once it arrives, something inside you begins refusing to go back to sleep. After that point, the world starts looking different. Not visually, psychologically. You begin noticing how deeply fear controls human behavior. Not dramatic fear, not life or death fear. Smaller fears that quietly shape entire personalities. The fear of rejection, the fear of criticism, the fear of being disliked, the fear of becoming too visible. Most people do not live according to truth, they live according to social consequences. And once you recognize this, you start understanding why authentic people often make others uncomfortable. Authenticity disrupts unconscious systems. A person who genuinely believes in themselves becomes harder to shame, harder to manipulate, harder to emotionally control through approval. That freedom unsettles people who still depend on external validation to feel valuable, especially because confidence exposes insecurity without saying a single word. A man uncertain about himself becomes irritated by another man's certainty. A person trapped in conformity secretly resents someone who lives freely. An insecure friend subtly discourages your growth while pretending to protect you. Not always intentionally. Human beings are masters of unconscious behavior. Sometimes people sabotage others simply to preserve their own psychological balance, because your transformation forces them to confront their stagnation. And most individuals would rather criticize growth than question their own limitations. People often attack in others what they abandoned within themselves. That is why self-belief changes your social reality so dramatically. The more connected you become to yourself, the more certain relationships begin collapsing naturally. Not because you became arrogant, because your energy stops negotiating for acceptance. You stop laughing at disrespect to avoid tension. You stop shrinking your ambitions to make insecure people comfortable. You stop treating your intuition like an enemy, and this creates friction, because many social structures depend on silent self-betrayal. Families, friendships, workplaces, relationships, entire systems quietly reward compliance and punish individuality. Jung understood this deeply. He believed most people never become individuals at all. They become reflections of collective expectations. Their personality becomes assembled from fear, imitation, and social conditioning. They choose careers they never wanted, adopt opinions they never examined, remain loyal to identities that secretly suffocate them. Then they spend years wondering why they feel empty. The soul knows when it is living dishonestly, and eventually psychological symptoms begin appearing like warning signals. Chronic anxiety, emotional numbness, constant comparison, the strange feeling that your life does not belong to you. But here is the disturbing part. The mind will tolerate misery longer than uncertainty, which means many people stay trapped simply because freedom initially feels unfamiliar. Freedom demands responsibility. No more blaming your parents, no more blaming society, no more blaming the people who underestimated you. Because once you truly believe in yourself, excuses begin dying, and that is where the real confrontation begins. Not with the world, with yourself, with every hidden fear that still whispers, "What if I fail? What if they reject me? What if I become everything I was told not to become?" And beneath all those fears sits the deepest one of all. What if I actually become who I was capable of being? That question changes everything, because most people secretly fear their potential more than their limitations. Limitations are familiar. Potential is unpredictable. A limited identity allows you to explain your failures before they happen. It protects the ego from risk. If you never fully try, you never fully confront what you are capable of becoming. So, people create invisible prisons. I'm just not confident. I'm not talented enough. I'm not the kind of person who succeeds. At first, these sound like observations, but repeated long enough, they become identity. And identity is dangerous, because the mind will defend it even when it causes suffering. A person who believes they are unworthy unconsciously gravitates toward disrespect. A person convinced they are weak avoids opportunities that require strength. A person addicted to approval slowly loses the ability to think independently. Not because fate controls them, because perception does. Jung believed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Most people never realize how much of their behavior is automatic. They think they are choosing, but often they are reacting. Reacting to childhood conditioning, to humiliation, to fear, to invisible emotional wounds that still control their nervous system years later. This is why two people can enter the same room and experience completely different realities. One sees opportunity. The other sees judgment. One speaks freely. The other monitors every sentence. One believes rejection is temporary. The other interprets it as proof of inadequacy. Reality bends around identity. And once you understand this, you begin realizing that believing in yourself is not optimism. It is psychological warfare against years of internal conditioning. Every moment of self-respect becomes an act of rebellion against the version of you built through fear. That version will not disappear quietly. It fights back. It tells you to stay invisible, to avoid risk, to remain acceptable, to silence yourself before others can reject you. And the terrifying part is how convincing that voice sounds, because it has protected you for years. But protection and imprisonment often wear the same face. The mind confuses safety with survival, even when the environment no longer threatens you. So you continue carrying emotional armor long after the war has ended. Hypervigilance, overthinking, constant self-monitoring. You call it personality. But often, it is unresolved fear pretending to be identity. Eventually, if a person remains trapped in this state long enough, resentment begins consuming them from the inside. Not only toward others, but toward themselves. Because deep down, they know. They remember every moment they stayed silent when they should have spoken. Every dream abandoned for social approval. Every instinct ignored to maintain belonging. The human soul keeps records of these betrayals. That is why some people feel exhausted even when they have done nothing physically demanding. They are carrying years of a suppressed identity. Then one day, usually after enough disappointment, enough loneliness, enough internal conflict, something shifts. They stop asking, "Will people accept me?" and begin asking something far more dangerous. Can I respect myself if I continue living this way? That question marks the beginning of psychological separation, not separation from society, but separation from illusion. Because once self-respect becomes more important than approval, human behavior reveals itself with terrifying clarity. You begin seeing how often people perform versions of themselves to secure acceptance. How many conversations are driven by status, insecurity, or hidden competition. How rarely people say what they truly mean. The social world begins feeling like a theater. Everyone acting. Everyone adjusting. Everyone protecting an identity they hope will be loved. And beneath it all sits a quiet desperation. The desperate need to feel significant. This is why people crave validation so intensely. Attention temporarily silences the fear of being invisible. Approval becomes emotional anesthesia. But anesthesia is not healing. The relief never lasts. So people chase more attention, more reassurance, more external proof that they matter. And in the process, they slowly surrender authority over their own identity. A person who depends entirely on external validation becomes psychologically owned by public opinion. That is why criticism destroys some people so completely. It does not merely wound them. It destabilizes their entire sense of self. But when someone begins believing in themselves, at a deeper level, criticism changes meaning. It still hurts, but it no longer defines reality, because internally, something solid has finally formed. Not ego. Alignment. The difference is enormous. Ego needs superiority. Alignment needs truth. Ego collapses when challenged. Alignment becomes clearer through challenge. Most people never experience this distinction because they spend their lives building personalities around appearances instead of authenticity. Jung believed the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parents. Think about how many fears are inherited. Parents who abandon their dreams unconsciously teach caution. Broken people teach emotional avoidance. Insecure people teach conformity. Entire generations pass down survival mechanisms disguised as wisdom. Don't stand out too much. Be realistic. Stay safe. Don't think too highly of yourself. Slowly, the individual spirit becomes domesticated. Not destroyed completely, just contained. Enough to function, enough to obey, enough to survive. But survival without meaning eventually creates psychological starvation. That starvation appears differently in different people. Some become chronically anxious. Some become emotionally numb. Some become addicted to distraction. Some become cynical because cynicism feels safer than hope. But underneath all of it lies the same hidden wound. They never became themselves. People can sense when someone has abandoned their own spirit. There is a heaviness to them, a quiet bitterness, a constant need to criticize others who still possess freedom, ambition, or authenticity. Because authenticity acts like a mirror, and mirrors become painful when someone has spent years avoiding their own reflection. The unsettling truth is that many people would rather attack your transformation than confront their own emptiness. Not because they hate you personally, because your growth exposes the life they settled for. Nothing provokes unconscious resentment faster than witnessing someone escape a psychological prison they still live inside. The moment you truly begin believing in yourself, you stop asking permission to exist. And for some people, that is unforgivable. So maybe believing in yourself was never about becoming louder than everyone else. Maybe it was about becoming honest enough to stop abandoning yourself in silence. Because in the end, the most dangerous person in any room is not the loudest one. It is the person who no longer needs approval to recognize their own worth. The person who sees through manipulation, notices hidden intentions, and understands human nature without becoming consumed by hatred. Someone who finally stopped betraying themselves just to remain accepted. Most people will spend their entire lives wearing masks so tightly that they forget there was ever a real face underneath. But a few people eventually wake up, and once they do, they can never fully return to sleep. So comment down below. What was the moment you realized you had been living for other people instead of yourself?